"Get out of my building," Chad Thorne sneered, his fingers tapping the glossy brochure of the planned Thorne Plaza. He tossed the formal lease modification notice across my polished mahogany desk, his face twisted in a smug grin. "Starting next month, your rent is $30,000. Pay up or pack your vintage junk and get the hell out." I looked down at the paper, then back up at his pristine tailored suit. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just slowly reached into my desk drawer, my fingers brushing against the heavy, original 2011 lease agreement. He thought he was holding all the cards, but he had no idea that a single, overlooked clause in that dusty document was about to pull the rug out from under his entire $45 million empire. But to understand how we got to this boardroom standoff, you have to go back 15 years. My name is Daniel Vance. I'm 52 years old, and for the last 3 decades, I've worked as an architectural restoration specialist. If you've ever admired the restored terracotta facades in downtown Seattle or the beautifully preserved timber beams inside the historic warehouses near the waterfront, there's a good chance my hands were involved. I don't just paint walls. I salvage history. I source reclaimed old-growth Douglas fir, restore 100-year-old leaded glass skylights, and consult on structural renovations for buildings that most developers would rather bulldoze and replace with sterile glass boxes. Back in June of 2011, when I was 37 years old, I was looking for a permanent home for my workshop and design gallery. The local real estate market was recovering from the crash, and downtown commercial spaces were sitting vacant. That's when I found the Foundry. It was a historic 3-story brick structure built in 1904, originally used as a metal fabrication shop. It had massive exposed timber columns, soaring 15-foot ceilings, and a spectacular 50-foot wide glass skylight that flooded the main floor with perfect natural light. It was exactly what I needed for my restoration studio and architectural salvage showroom. The building was owned by Thorne Holdings, a family-run real estate firm. The patriarch at the time was Thomas Thorne, a traditional old-school gentleman who respected craftsmanship and history. Thomas was 64 then, and he loved my vision for the space. He didn't want to see the Foundry torn down. We sat down in his office, drank black coffee, and hammered out a 25-year commercial lease. Because I was planning to invest over $200,000 of my own money to restore the skylight, reinforce the heavy timber trusses, and install high-capacity electrical systems for my industrial wood and stone carving machinery, I needed ironclad security. I couldn't risk spending my life savings on a space only to be kicked out a few years later. Thomas understood this. He agreed to a flat rent of $6,000 a month, adjusted only for basic inflation every 5 years, and gave me absolute tenancy security. But Thomas was also a smart businessman, and he owned the 3 adjacent parcels surrounding the Foundry. At the time, those parcels were just flat asphalt parking lots used by nearby office workers. Thomas told me, "Daniel, one day my family might want to build on those lots, but I want to make sure your studio always has the light it needs. An architectural salvage gallery is nothing without natural sunlight." So Thomas had his legal team draft a specific addendum, which we signed and recorded with the King County Recorder's Office. It was Section 14.2 of the lease agreement, titled Covenant for Light, Air, and Solar Access. This wasn't just a standard landlord promise. It was a formal perpetual easement appurtenant that ran with the land. It legally prohibited Thorne Holdings, or any future owner of the adjacent 3 parcels, from erecting any structure that exceeded 35 feet in height or 3 stories within a 75-foot radius of my historic skylight. If they did, it would block the natural solar path required for my studio's solar array and restoration work. To ensure the easement had teeth, Thomas's older brother Richard Thorne, who was the company's silent partner, insisted on adding a liquidated damages clause in Section 17.4. The clause stated that if the landlord violated the light easement or attempted to terminate the lease early without the tenant's written consent, the landlord would be liable for a penalty equal to 12% of the total projected construction cost of any non-compliant structure, and the tenant would have the right to purchase the adjacent parcels at their tax-assessed value. Back then, 12% of a potential 3-story office building was a minor detail. Nobody envisioned a massive skyscraper. Thomas Thorne passed away in 2013, just 2 years after we signed the lease. His younger brother, Richard Thorne, who was 55 then and is now 68, took over as the managing partner of Thorne Holdings. Richard was different from Thomas. He didn't care about history, architecture, or craftsmanship. He cared about density, square footage, and cash flow. For the next 12 years, Richard tolerated me because I paid my rent on the first of every month like clockwork, maintained the building meticulously, and never caused any issues. But things changed when Richard's nephew, Chad Thorne, joined the firm. Chad was 31, fresh out of an Ivy League business school, and radiating the kind of unearned arrogance that only comes from nepotism. He walked around the office wearing $1,000 loafers, talking about asset optimization and highest and best use. To Chad, the foundry wasn't a historic landmark. It was an underutilized asset sitting on prime downtown land that could be leveraged for a much higher return. In late 2025, Chad convinced Richard to launch Thorne Plaza, a massive $45 million development project. They planned to demolish the parking lots and construct a 35-story luxury residential tower with ground-floor retail. The problem was that the footprint of their new tower would wrap directly around the foundry, completely blocking the skylight and violating the solar access easement. Chad assumed I was just a small-time tenant who could be easily bullied. He didn't bother to read the historical lease archives. He just saw a tenant paying $6,000 a month in a neighborhood where market rates had climbed significantly. He figured he could use high-pressure tactics to force me to sign a voluntary lease termination, clearing the way for their grand project. That was his first and most expensive mistake. He didn't realize that my lease held the ultimate kill switch for his entire career. The harassment began slowly in October of 2025. It started with minor inconveniences designed to wear me down. First, Chad Thorne ordered the parking lot attendants to block my loading zone with construction dumpsters. For an architectural salvage business that regularly moves massive timber beams, reclaimed cast iron gates, and heavy stone mantles, losing the loading zone was a major operational blow. I sent a polite email to Richard Thorne, reminding him that Section 5.3 of our lease guaranteed unobstructed access to the rear loading bay 24 hours a day. Richard didn't reply. Instead, I got a call from Chad. "Daniel," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The dumpsters are for site testing. We're preparing the adjacent lots for development. You need to adapt. This isn't the sleepy downtown of 2011 anymore. We need to modernize, and honestly, your little workshop is holding this entire block back." I kept my voice flat and professional. "Chad, the lease guarantees the loading zone. Please move the dumpsters by tomorrow morning, or I'll have to hire a private towing service and bill Thorne Holdings for the cost, as permitted under Section 19.2. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Try it, Daniel. Let's see how long you want to play lawyer. We own this property. You just rent it." The dumpsters weren't moved. I hired a heavy-duty towing company, cleared the loading zone, and sent the $1,200 invoice to Thorne Holdings via registered mail. 2 days later, my water pressure suddenly dropped to a trickle. Then, the private security guards hired by Thorne Holdings began questioning my clients, claiming the building was entering a pre-demolition phase and was unsafe for visitors. On a rainy Tuesday morning in November, Chad showed up at my workshop. He didn't knock. He walked in, flanked by 2 men in hard hats holding digital surveying equipment. They began measuring my showroom floor, talking loudly over the hum of my restoration machinery. I turned off my bandsaw, took off my safety glasses, and walked over to them. "Chad, you're violating my right to quiet enjoyment under Section 8.1 of the lease. You cannot enter these premises without 48 hours written notice, except in an emergency." Chad turned to me, smirking. He didn't look at the historic timber trusses or the beautiful leaded glass skylight. He just saw space to be cleared. "Daniel, let's cut the crap. You've had a good run here. $6,000 a month for a 5,000 square foot footprint in this zip code is a joke. We're building Thorne Plaza. It's a $45 million project. The city has already approved our preliminary zoning permits. Your lease is an obstacle." He pulled out a blue folder and laid it on my assembly table, right on top of a century-old stained glass window I was restoring. This is a voluntary lease termination agreement. We'll give you $50,000 to pack up and vacate by the end of the year. That's more than fair for a business that basically sells dusty trash. I didn't touch the folder. I have 10 years left on my lease, Chad. I have no intention of leaving. My business relies on this location and this specific natural light. The answer is no. Chad's smirk vanished. His face flushed red, and he stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. Listen to me, you stubborn old relic. You think you're safe because of a piece of paper signed 15 years ago? My Uncle Richard runs this company now, and we have a team of corporate lawyers on retainer who make more in an hour than you make in a month. If you don't sign this, we will make your life a living hell. We'll find a way to break this lease. Understood, I said quietly. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply took the blue folder, set it on my desk, and pointed toward the door. Now, please leave my shop. You've exceeded your welcome. You're making a massive mistake, Chad spat, gesturing to his surveyors to pack up. Enjoy your week, Daniel. It's going to get very expensive for you. 3 days later, the real blow landed. A courier delivered a formal notarized letter from Thorne Holdings. It was signed by Richard Thorne, but the language had Chad's arrogant fingerprints all over it. The letter stated that due to extraordinary increases in property taxes, structural insurance, and municipal utility assessments, the landlord was exercising its right under a supposed fair market adjustment clause to increase my rent. Starting December 1st, my monthly rent would jump from $6,000 to $30,000. Furthermore, the letter claimed that if I failed to pay the new amount or vacate the premises within 30 days, Thorne Holdings would initiate immediate unlawful detainer proceedings, lock me out of the building, and seize my inventory to cover the unpaid rent. It was a blatant, illegal attempt to force me out. They knew I couldn't afford $30,000 a month. My business generates steady revenue, but a 5-fold rent increase would bankrupt me in 90 days. They expected me to panic, hire a cheap lawyer, realize I couldn't afford a long legal battle, and accept their $50,000 buyout. They didn't know I had already contacted Sarah Lynn. Sarah was a senior partner at Lynn & Associates, a top-tier real estate litigation firm in Seattle. She was 48, razor-sharp, and specialized in defending historic properties against rapacious developers. I took the rent increase notice and my original 2011 lease agreement to her office. We sat in her high-rise boardroom, overlooking the very skyline that Chad Thorne wanted to dominate. Sarah spent 2 hours reviewing the master lease, page by page. When she reached Section 14.2 and Section 17.4, a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. She looked up at me, her eyes gleaming. "Daniel, did Chad Thorne actually put this rent increase in writing?" "Yes," I replied, handing her the notarized letter. "And they've already started site prep on the parking lots." Sarah let out a soft laugh. "Then Chad Thorne has just handed us the keys to his uncle's vault. They think they're playing checkers, but they just walked right into a buzzsaw." Sarah Lynn leaned back in her leather chair, tapping her pen on the original 2011 lease. "Daniel, commercial real estate developers like Richard and Chad Thorne operate on leverage. They borrow massive amounts of capital from Wall Street banks to fund these projects. Those loans are contingent on clean titles, secured building permits, and a complete absence of litigation. A single cloud on the title can freeze their funding. And we don't just have a cloud, we have a Category 5 hurricane." She pulled up the property registry maps on her screen, pointing to the 3 adjoining parcels surrounding the foundry. "Section 14.2 of your lease is a restrictive covenant for light and air. It is an easement appurtenant, which means it is legally tied to the land itself, not just the owners. When Thomas Thorne recorded this in 2011, he bound all future owners of those parcels. Any building taller than 35 feet within a 75-foot radius of your skylight is a direct violation." She then scrolled down to Section 17.4. And here is the kill switch. The liquidated damages clause. If they violate the easement or attempt an illegal eviction, they must pay you 12% of the total projected development cost of the non-compliant structure. In this case, Thorn Plaza is publicly budgeted at $45 million. That means they owe you $5,400,000 in cash penalties. My jaw dropped slightly. $5.4 million? Yes, Sarah said, a cold, tactical look in her eyes. But it gets better. Section 17.4 also grants you the option to purchase the adjacent 3 parcels at their county tax-assessed value if they default on this penalty. The tax-assessed value of those parking lots is currently $3 million. But their actual development value, with the permits they just secured? Easily $15 million. If we enforce this, we can take their land and halt their $45 million project. But we couldn't just walk into court with promises, we needed concrete proof. That night, Sarah contacted Oliver Brooks, a veteran licensed land surveyor. Oliver was 54, meticulous, and had spent his life surveying construction boundaries in the Pacific Northwest. Under the cover of early morning light, Oliver and his crew arrived at the foundry. Using high-precision GPS receivers, robotic total stations, and 3D laser scanners, they mapped the exact boundary lines of the 3 adjacent parcels and the precise center point of my historic skylight. By mid-afternoon, Oliver had compiled the survey data. It was definitive. The preliminary foundation plan for Thorn Plaza, which involved drilling deep concrete pilings for a 35-story tower, placed the main elevator shaft and structural columns directly within the 75-foot radius of my skylight. The proposed tower would stand over 400 feet tall, completely obliterating my solar access and violating the 35-foot height limit by over 365 feet. They've already started drilling the perimeter shoring walls, Oliver said, showing me the digital overlay. They are actively violating the easement as we speak. Perfect, Sarah said when she received the survey. Now we strike. Instead of responding to the illegal rent increase notice, we let the deadline approach. On November 30th, the day before the 40% rent hike was supposed to take effect, Sarah filed a massive lawsuit in the King County Superior Court. The lawsuit, case number 25-2-18400 SEA, was a multi-pronged legal assault. First, it sued Thorn Holdings for breach of contract and attempted illegal eviction, citing the rent stabilization clause in Section 3.1 of our lease, which strictly capped any annual adjustment to the Consumer Price Index, which was currently at 2.8%. The $300,000 annual rent increase they demanded was a clear violation. Second, the lawsuit sought an immediate temporary restraining order, TRO, and a permanent injunction to halt all construction activities on the adjacent parcels, citing active violation of the recorded solar access easement under Washington RCW 64.04.14. Third, we filed a lis pendens against all 3 adjacent parcels. A lis pendens is a formal, public notice filed in the county real estate records, indicating that the title and usage rights of the property are subject to active litigation. It is the ultimate poison pill for a developer. No bank will release construction funds, and no title insurance company will issue a policy when a lis pendens is active. Finally, we demanded the immediate payment of the $5,400,000 liquidated damages penalty under Section 17.4 and petitioned the court to enforce my option to purchase the 3 parcels for their $3 million tax-assessed value. We didn't notify Chad or Richard Thorne beforehand. We let the court system do the talking. On Monday morning, December 1st at 8 a.m., the construction crew for Thorn Plaza arrived at the site. Bulldozers, excavators, and drilling rigs lined the street, ready to begin the heavy excavation. Chad Thorne was there, wearing a bright yellow hard hat and a pristine orange safety vest, surrounded by local city officials and investors for a ceremonial groundbreaking at 8:15 a.m. Just as Chad was stepping up to a microphone to address the crowd, a process server walked past the security guards. He approached Chad, handed him a thick stack of legal documents, and said, "Chad Thorne, you've been served." At the exact same moment, Sarah's team was in front of a Superior Court judge, presenting Oliver Brooks' survey data and the original 2011 lease. By 9 a.m., the judge signed the temporary restraining order. The order was clear. All construction, drilling, and site prep on the adjacent parcels had to cease immediately. Any violation would result in contempt of court charges and immediate arrest. I stood on the second-floor balcony of the foundry, looking out through the historic glass panes. I watched Chad read the papers, his face turning from a confident smirk to a pasty, terrified white. He looked up at my balcony, his eyes wide with shock and fury. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. The battle had officially begun, and the arrogant developer had just realized he was completely trapped. The fallout from the injunction was immediate and catastrophic for Thorn Holdings. By Monday afternoon, the heavy machinery on the adjacent lots was turned off, the engines idling in a silent, expensive stalemate. The subcontractors, who were being paid by the hour, stood around smoking cigarettes before their foreman finally sent them home. But the real panic wasn't on the construction site. It was in the executive suites of Thorn Holdings. To fund the $45 million Thorn Plaza, Richard and Chad had secured a $30 million construction loan from Pacific National Bank. Under the terms of the loan agreement, the bank required clear, unencumbered title to the land and a complete absence of any litigation. The moment Sarah Lynn filed the lis pendens in the King County property records, the bank's compliance automated system flagged the project. By Tuesday morning, Pacific National Bank officially froze all loan disbursements. Thorn Holdings was suddenly cut off from their capital. They had already spent over $6 million of their own cash on architectural fees, zoning permits, and structural engineering. Now they were facing massive subcontractor, holding fees of $85,000 a week to keep the heavy drilling equipment on site, plus $10,000 a day in interest charges on their active land acquisition loans. Every day the site was frozen, Thorn Holdings was bleeding nearly $20,000. If the project remained stalled for more than 30 days, the subcontractors would default, and the bank would have the right to call the entire $30 million loan, forcing the firm into bankruptcy. Then came the calls. My phone started ringing on Tuesday at 7 a.m. It was Chad. I didn't answer. By Wednesday afternoon, I had 47 missed calls and 18 emails from him. His emails went from demanding and threatening to desperate. "Daniel, we need to talk. This is a misunderstanding. Let's work this out. Daniel, call me immediately. We can discuss a better relocation package. Mr. Vance, please reply. My Uncle Richard wants to meet with you personally." I forwarded every single call and email directly to Sarah Lynn. I didn't say a word to him. I went about my work, carefully restoring the stained glass window under the beautiful natural light of my skylight. On Thursday morning, Richard Thorne's personal attorney contacted Sarah, begging for an emergency settlement meeting. Sarah agreed, but only on our terms. The meeting would take place at her office, and Chad Thorne had to be present to face the consequences of his actions. On Friday afternoon, we gathered in the main conference room of Lynn & Associates. Richard Thorne looked 10 years older than his 68 years. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and he sat quietly at the head of the table. Chad, however, looked completely broken. The arrogant Ivy League graduate who had sneered at my dusty trash was now sitting with slumped shoulders, nervously tapping his expensive leather shoes on the carpet. Sarah Lynn opened the meeting by laying out the hard facts. "Richard, Chad," she began, sliding a folder across the table. "You've been served with our complaint. We have filed a lis pendens on all 3 parcels. The court has granted a temporary restraining order. We have Oliver Brooks's certified survey showing that your proposed build violates the light easement by 365 feet. We are prepared to litigate this for the next 3 years. We have the capital, and our client has a 25-year lease that doesn't expire until 2036. Richard sighed, looking at his nephew with cold fury. "Chad told me the lease was a standard template. He said there were no active encumbrances." "Chad was incompetent," Sarah replied flatly. "He didn't read the historical archives. And by attempting to illegally raise Daniel's rent to $30,000, you actively breached the covenant of quiet enjoyment and the rent stabilization clause. That breach triggered Section 17.4. You now owe my client a liquidated damages penalty of 12% of the project cost. That is $5,400,000. If you cannot pay, we will enforce the option to purchase the 3 parcels for $3 million. Your project is dead." Richard turned to Chad, his voice trembling with anger. "Get out." Chad blinked, stunned. Uncle Richard. I get the hell out of this room, Chad, Richard growled. You've ruined this company. Pack your things. You're fired. Chad stood up, his face burning red with humiliation, and shuffled out of the conference room without saying a word. The door clicked shut behind him. Richard turned back to us, his hands shaking slightly. Daniel, please. We've known each other for 15 years. My brother Thomas respected you. I know I've let Chad run wild, and that was my mistake. But a $5 million penalty will bankrupt Thorn Holdings. We will lose everything. Surely there is a middle ground that allows us to build the tower without destroying my family's legacy. I looked at Richard. I had no desire to destroy his late brother's company, but I was going to make sure my business was secure and that I was compensated for the harassment I had endured. I'm willing to talk, Richard, I said, leaning forward, but the terms will be mine, and they will be non-negotiable. Sarah, Lynn, and I had spent the night before the meeting drafting our settlement agreement. We knew Richard Thorne was cornered. He couldn't afford to walk away, and he couldn't afford to fight. Sarah slid the final settlement terms across the table to Richard's attorney. Here are the conditions under which Daniel Vance will agree to dismiss the lawsuit and release the lis pendens, she said. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the document. The first condition was the preservation of my business. The rent for the foundry was to remain locked at $6,000 a month for the remaining 10 years of the lease. All future inflation adjustments and tax escalations were completely waived. Furthermore, Thorn Holdings had to sign a formal, legally binding covenant guaranteeing that they would never attempt another eviction or lease termination for the duration of the tenancies. The second condition was a complete reimbursement of all my legal and operational expenses. Thorn Holdings had to pay $90,000 directly to Lynn and Associates to cover my legal fees and Oliver Brooks's survey work. The third, and most critical condition, was the easement modification payment. Instead of enforcing the full $5,400,000 liquidated damages penalty, I agreed to sign a limited modification to the solar access easement. This modification would allow them to build the tower, but only if they redesigned the structure's footprint. They had to implement a 30-foot structural setback on the lower 10 stories of the tower, ensuring that my historic glass skylight would continue to receive unobstructed morning and afternoon sunlight. In exchange for this easement modification, Thorn Holdings had to pay me a cash settlement of $4 million. The funds had to be wire transferred directly into a secure escrow account before we would sign the motion to dismiss the lawsuit or lift the lis pendens. Richard's lawyer leaned over, whispering into his client's ear. He pointed to the numbers, nodding slowly. He knew this was the only way to save the project. A $4 million payout, combined with the cost of redesigning the tower's base, would cut their projected profits by 30%. But it was far better than a total collapse, bankruptcy, and the loss of their $15 million land parcel. Richard looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of defeat and respect. You're a tough man, Daniel. You got this from my brother Thomas, didn't you? He always said you had a steel spine. Thomas was a fair landlord, Richard, I replied. If Chad had respected his word in our lease, we would never have been sitting in this room. Richard nodded slowly. He picked up his Mont Blanc pen and signed the agreement. We will have the funds in escrow by Monday morning. Please have your surveyors verify the new footprint designs as soon as they are drafted. We will, Sarah said. By Tuesday afternoon, the wire transfer had cleared. The $4 million sat securely in my corporate account. Sarah filed the voluntary dismissal, and the lis pendens was officially lifted. The consequences for the Thorne family were swift. Chad Thorne was completely cast out of the family business. Richard stripped him of his shares and evicted him from the luxury company-owned condominium he had been living in. Word of Chad's incompetence spread rapidly through the close-knit Seattle real estate community. No major developer would hire him, and his reputation as the junior executive who almost bankrupted a multi-million-dollar firm followed him everywhere. Last I heard, he had relocated to a small property management firm in a different state, working as a low-level leasing agent. Richard Thorne retired 6 months later, handing the daily operations of Thorn Holdings over to a professional board of trustees who had no interest in bullying tenants. With my $4 million settlement, my life changed dramatically, but my daily routine stayed the same. I kept my workshop at the foundry. I paid my $6,000 a month, knowing that my lease was the most secure legal document in the city. I used $1 million of the settlement money to establish the Thorn Vance Foundation for Historic Preservation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping local craftsmen and small businesses secure and restore historic commercial spaces in downtown Seattle. The remaining $3 million was invested in a conservative, tax-free municipal bond portfolio, ensuring that my future was completely secure. Today, the Thorn Plaza Tower stands completed. It is a massive glass structure, but if you walk down Historic Way, you will see a 30-foot setback at its base. And right next to it, nestled in the shadow of the giant, sits the foundry, untouched and perfectly preserved. Sometimes, when I'm working at my bench, restoring a piece of 19th century timber or polishing a salvaged copper fixture, I look up at the glass skylight. The morning sun streams through the panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It's the same sunlight that Thomas Thorn promised me 15 years ago, and every time I feel its warmth, I'm reminded of a simple truth. In the world of big money and corporate towers, a signed contract is still the most powerful weapon in the world.